There are two holidays on the calendar that every year strike fear into the hearts of Unitarian Universalist preachers. Easter and Christmas. These Christ-centric holidays force us as a people of faith, as an aspiring, beloved community of diverse beliefs, to confront some of the unsettled and maybe even unsettling aspects of our own history and theology. These holidays draw into sharp relief the great distance that exists between the farthest poles of our religiously pluralistic community. We have in our midst several folks who came to Unitarian Universalism explicitly because they were trying to run away from all things Christian. But we also have among us folks who strongly self-identify as Christian. We have folks among us who identify as ardent humanists or atheists with no desire to really explore the supernatural. And we also have folks who are unapologetically theistic and explicitly believe in, or at least hold space for, the possibility that there are things in this universe that can never be explained. So these holidays, Easter and Christmas, they force us, a UU community, to confront our religious biases and acutely feel the tension that necessarily exists between all our theological polarities. And I've come to learn firsthand, regarding the sermons I preach around these holidays, that they will pretty much always be received like a lost chapter from Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Some will declare the sermon too Christian, others will declare the sermon wasn't Christian enough, and if I'm lucky, then I might get a few who will say the sermon was just right. So at the conclusion of today's sermon, feel free to sort yourself into whatever category you'd like. I will not be offended. It's no skin off my back. All in all, it's a small price to pay for a genuine attempt to live our principles and to honor our sources, specifically to encourage everyone on their free and responsible search for truth and meaning, and to not forsake Jewish and Christian teachings which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. These Judeo-Christian teachings are part of our historical, cultural, and theological birthright as Unitarians, as Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists, even if they don't fit us quite right anymore. Now, it's no secret that Unitarian Universalism, along with liberal Christianity generally, took a rather hard turn towards humanism in the mid to late 20th century. So it's not surprising that we saw in those years increased interest and scholarship regarding the humanity of Jesus, his historicity. We wanted to discover who the real Jesus was, the man behind the myth, so to speak. So in the 1980s, for instance, we saw the formation of the Jesus Seminar, an ecumenical group of liberal Christian academics who explored this question explicitly. The basic consensus by many of these Jesus scholars and others was that Jesus probably was a real historical figure who perhaps over time was mythologized until he was eventually recognized by his followers not just as the Messiah, not just as the Son of God, but even as God himself. So it became the aim of these Jesus scholars to discover who the real Jesus was and how this Jesus became the Christ. But that's not what I want to talk about today. Instead, I'd rather explore a slightly but significantly different question. Who was the real Christ, and how over time did this Christ become Jesus? Here's what I mean by that. Anyone who has made even a cursory study of ancient religions can tell you that Jesus wasn't the first Christ figure. In other words, there were Christs before Christ. Osiris, Dionysus, Attis, Adonis, Mithras, Orpheus, Zoroaster, Tammuz, and Baal, to name just a few. a brief study of these figures reveal a man-god or god-man, often conceived by a virgin, born around solstice, December 25th-ish, prophesied by a star, visited by magi, who turned water into wine, healed the sick, raised the dead, instituted a bread and wine communion among his followers, died on a cross or hung from a tree, descended into hell, and then rose again 3 days later. So this dying and resurrecting God motif, which today I'm loosely referring to as the story of the Christ, was a well-established mythic trope that predated Jesus by hundreds and sometimes thousands of years. And the similarities between the supernatural elements of the Jesus story and the pre-existing stories of his pagan predecessors were so striking that Jesus' early followers were basically accused of appropriating these myths and attaching them to Jesus. So in the early centuries of the Common Era, the story of Jesus Christ, from the perspective of the rest of the pagan world, was nothing more than a poorly plagiarized bit of Jewish fan fiction. Consider these words from Celsus, a famous 2nd century Greek pagan philosopher who wrote the following about Jesus and early Christians. Are these distinctive happenings regarding Jesus unique to the Christians? And if so, how are they unique? Or are ours to be accounted myths and theirs to be believed? What reasons do the Christians give for the distinctiveness of their beliefs? In truth, there is nothing at all unusual about what the Christians believe, except that they believe it to the exclusion of more comprehensive truths about God. Now, a good question to ask is, how did the early church fathers, the early Christian church fathers, respond to this charge of plagiarism? Well, one thing they did not do, they did not deny the similarities. They readily admitted the similarities' existence. They had to. The similarities were just too obvious. So instead of denying these similarities, they came up with a theory to explain why those similarities were not evidence of religious plagiarism. It's a theory today called diabolical mimicry. And the theory argues that the devil purposely created false Christs in the centuries leading up to the life of Jesus, kind of like reverse echoes, so that when the genuine article actually showed up in the form of Jesus, people would be disinclined to believe that Jesus was a unique Christ. 2nd century Christian apologist Justin Martyr wrote that the early pagan myths of Christ-like figures, quote, have been uttered by the influence of the wicked demons to deceive and lead astray the human race. For having heard it proclaimed through the prophets that the Christ was come, they put forward many to be called sons of Jupiter, under the impression that they would be able to produce in men the idea that the things which were said with regard to Christ were mere marvelous tales, like the things which were said by the pagan poets. Likewise, Tertullian, another famous 2nd century Christian father, wrote this: the devil, whose business is to pervert the truth, mimics the exact circumstances of the divine sacraments. Thus, he celebrates the oblation of bread and brings in the symbol of the resurrection. Let us therefore acknowledge the craftiness of the devil, who copies certain things of those that be divine. So in essence, diabolical mimicry is a theory of reverse plagiarism. It argues that what appears to be a 1,000-year-old copy is in fact the original document, and that the multiple predecessors that existed centuries before, that those are in fact the plagiarized copies. So think about this. The stories of Jesus Christ and the pagan gods were so similar that the early church fathers believed that the diabolical mimicry theory was more persuasive and compelling than arguing that the similarities were mere coincidence. To argue that there were no substantial similarities between Jesus Christ and his pagan predecessors would be like when in the early 90s, Vanilla Ice tried to argue that the hook in Ice Ice Baby was not the bass line from Under Pressure by Queen. There's a video of this on YouTube. You should go and watch it. It's hilarious. Also showing my age a bit, aren't I? Now that said, whether these undeniable similarities are the product of coincidence, the devil, or whether Jesus is just a 1st century Palestinian Jewish remix of previous Christs, personally, I really don't know. Moreover, I don't care to speculate. If Jesus was a unique Christ, as Christians throughout history have believed, it is no skin off my back. And I am not here today to pop any theological balloons. In fact, my commitment to religious pluralism and my desire to be in authentic relationship with people of diverse beliefs prohibits me from attacking or overly critiquing such beliefs. If a Christian tells me that they genuinely believe that Jesus was a unique Christ, it is not my place to suggest they are incorrect, irrational, or ignorant. I wouldn't dare do that to a Muslim regarding their belief about Muhammad. I wouldn't dare do that to a Buddhist about their beliefs regarding Siddhartha. Now, I have no problem personally articulating why I personally may or may not hold a particular belief. But as a Unitarian Universalist, I'm not interested in trying to proselytize the rest of the world into believing the same things that I do. So all of that, then, is context for what I'm about to say, which is this. I, personally speaking, don't really care about the so-called historical Jesus. Was he a carpenter? Was he a rabbi, a healer, a miracle worker, a mentally disturbed, self-appointed apocalyptic prophet? I do not know, and frankly, I don't really care. Others do care a lot, and that is awesome, but it's just not my bag. And that's because, personally speaking, I don't find the historical Jesus, whichever permutation might be, I don't find that historical Jesus particularly interesting. What I find more interesting, personally, is this Christ person, the mythologized, supernatural, human divine being who dies for his people and rises from the dead. Why does that guy keep showing up in religions across the world over and over and over again, whether it comes up organically and independently or whether it is intentionally plagiarized? This story keeps coming up. That would suggest to me that people really love this story. They can't get enough of it. I would dare say it's a universal story. It's as if there's something about our shared human condition and experience that keeps driving us toward this recurring story. So what's up with that? Whatever it is, it suggests to me that there is great value and great truth to be mined in the story of Jesus Christ, including the story of Christmas. An emotional, a psychological, a spiritual truth and honesty that transcends history or historicity and is worthy of our great respect. There is so much to learn from the Christmas story. And every year I challenge myself to find new aspects of that story to contemplate in order to illuminate my own life. And in the brief time we have left together this morning, I'd like to share with you the revelation that I have been digesting this Christmas season. First, I'd like to note that metaphors are dangerous things. As a pedagogical strategy, using a metaphor is risky business. What you're doing is you're taking a concrete object and using it to represent an abstract concept, and something is always going to get lost in translation. So a metaphor can help to clarify a difficult abstract idea, but it can also inadvertently limit that difficult abstract idea. And there is no bigger, more difficult, more abstract idea than the idea of God, whatever God may be. And so I often wonder if humanity's varied attempts throughout history of assigning God a symbolic metaphor, if that has done more damage than good, if it has served to limit the infinite and ineffable rather than help us to conceptualize it. Take, for instance, the popular Judeo-Christian metaphor of God as a father. That's what I was raised to believe God was like. And honestly, for me, that was pretty great, because I'm a dude. So hearing at a young age that God was also a dude, that was very validating. Thank you very much. That little theological fact helped me win a lot of arguments with Christian girls growing up. And of course, by win, I really mean act like a chauvinistic fool. There's the problem with metaphors. They're useful to some degree, but we also have to remember that just because God can reasonably be analogized to a father figure, that does not foreclose the possibility that God can also be understood as a mother, or a brother, or a sister, or an ungendered or omnigendered being, as a child, and not just any child, our child. The Christmas story, viewed from the lens of Orthodox Christianity, is the story of God becoming our child, our little baby. What could that possibly mean? How does one even begin to ponder this profound reality? Perhaps it means that all that is great and good in this world, our highest ideals and aspirations, the values we would live and die for, the principles we would lift up and worship, perhaps it means that the greatest good in this universe must be birthed by us, and that this greatest of all goods is far more fragile than we are comfortable admitting. That to survive and grow, this good needs nurturing and caring and protecting so that it can become what it must be. Which might further suggest that God itself is a process, constantly evolving and growing, and just perhaps influenced by human hands. If there is something that I have learned this past year in 2017, it is that progress toward the ultimate good is not inevitable. Humanity is not marching inexorably toward a promised land. There is no guarantee that the light will defeat the darkness. And in times of great darkness, the light of hope, much like a newborn infant, may appear small and fragile. And it will take all of us, all the Marys, and all the Josephs, and all the angels, all the shepherds, and all the wise men called from afar. It will take all of us coming together to act as guardians and protectors of that hope, to incarnate and grow that hope until love and justice and righteousness fully mature and become a reality for every single one of us. This is the meditation of my heart this Christmas. May we all guard and nurture this most sacred hope, both now and tomorrow. May it be so. Blessed be, and Merry Christmas.